So let's move on. And my name is Maria Simani, and I'm the current executive director for the California Science Project. That is my email address. And I'm also typing it right now into my into the chat window for your understanding. What we are trying to do today is to reflect a moment on the on teaching and learning that are necessary when we are trying to implement the California Next Generation Science Standards, so that we can point to consider what is that we need to do in our classroom with our students. And then I would like also to provide you a bit more resources on what would be your next steps. You are probably all in different places with the implementation of the Next Generation Science Standards. So you have to decide for yourself what might be your next steps. Again, currently I muted everybody, but you can unmute your computer if you want to share a comment with everybody. I'm sharing right now my screen. This presentation is being recorded, and we are going to use the chat window at any time to ask questions. I have embedded in this presentation Q&A pauses so that we can have a more dynamic presentation. So, and with that, I'm going to move on. In these next slides, what you are seeing is this Venn diagram that showcase how the newish, now I call it the newish because the adoption of the Common Core in California started in 2010, and the Next Generation Science Standard is dated 2013, so we are not really in the prime. Oh, sorry, it keeps, I'm sorry, something is wrong with my, I'm still here. There we go. There we go. So in this Venn diagram, one thing that I would like to highlight is how all these new educational reforms are trying to converge in a single point that relates to students' ability to think critically, but also communicating more effectively, collaborating, and being really creative in their way of engaging with others and with the subject matter. So one first question that I would like you to think on your own, and perhaps I'm going to give you like 30 seconds to think, is what do you think is science? So we are going to talk about NGSS, so it makes sense to start the conversation by asking, what do you think is science? And share some of your ideas in the chat window. I'm going to open it up. All right, so we have Krista, science is the study of creations, order, organizations, laws, system. Mark mentioned the study of the natural world, learning about processes of nature through experimentation. Include testing of ideas to better understand the world around us. And these are all very excellent answers that really highlight science as a very dynamic enterprise. So in the framework for K-12 science education, that is the document that is foundational to the development of the California Next Generation Science Standards. The definition of science is as follows. Science is not just a body of knowledge that reflects current understanding of the world. It is also a set of practices used to establish, extend, and refine that knowledge. Both elements, knowledge and practices, are essential. So that is a very dynamic view of our approach to science. And I keep seeing here, science is a hands-on experience. technology includes the use of science. So asking questions, testing idea, and I'm just using all the sharing of ideas that you're doing in the chat window. So you have these dynamic ideas of the enterprise of science. When we are looking at the logo of the next generation science standards, and here I'm referring to page 1 of the handouts that you have downloaded from the website, you should see this logo on page 1. And on page 1, you also have the list of the 3 dimensions of the next generation science standards. We have the orange component, the dimension 3. Those are the one on the left side of the handout. And these represent the disciplinary core ideas. Dimension 1 are the blue components and are the science and engineering practices. And in the end, the cross-cutting concepts are what connects disciplines together and is our second dimension. So if you want to link these 3 NGSS dimensions to the work of scientists, I'm moving to the next slides, and what you can see is that dimension 1 is what scientists do. Dimension 2 is how scientists think, and dimension 3, the disciplinary core ideas, is what scientists know. To properly educate students in how science is done, we need all the 3 dimensions to work together in order for them to have an appreciation that knowledge comes because scientists are thinking and are doing something. And that's how they can use their knowledge. So as a next exercise, I would like you to go on page 3 of your handouts. And on that handout, you should see 2 vignettes. There are 2 short narratives of 2 different classrooms. So what I would like you to do, the prompt is on the screen, read the 2 vignettes and try to answer these questions. What are the students learning in each one? What are the students doing in each one? And what is the role of the teacher in each one of the vignettes? And if I'm entering this classroom and I'm asking the students, what is science? What do you think they might answer? So I perhaps going to give you 7 minutes for this exercise to read both vignettes and think about answer these questions. I hope you are all able to see the chat window. The topic in both vignettes is the students are learning about the phases of the moon, but there is a very distinct way in which the teacher is managing the activities, facilitating the activities in the first one, compared the second one. And somebody before earlier mentioned that the first vignette is more teacher-centered, while the second one is more student-centered. Yeah, and depending on the role that the teachers have in one of the 2 vignettes, the students will be led to understand that science is only done in a certain way by certain people, and so forth, rather than being, and okay, cancel. So, and this is the important part, and I like that somebody already started thinking about assessment of students and the thinking process that the students are asked to do in the 2 vignettes, because it's not only about, so that the topic that the students are engaging learning is the same in both vignettes, but the way they are brought to study this topic is very different in the two vignettes. So you might also consider the opportunity that the two different types of teaching the students can bring to assess students about their critical thinking and not only about their memorization skills. Another aspect that might be important to you is what would an administrator or a parent come and see if they are visiting your classroom and see the students engage in two different ways, and which one do you think the students might be more engaged and excited and really feeling more like scientists in the two domains? So what I wanted to share with you is that we are analyzing this type of instruction in the California Science Framework, and we call something that is similar vignette 1 the knowing about frame, and the second one we call it the figuring out frame, because the students are engaged, like many of you have mentioned in the chat window. They are engaged in explaining phenomena, something that they have observed, and now they're trying to explain. So in this information frame, vignette 1, students are focused on learning information and that is delivered to them by somebody. And so science, if we are only doing that, the information delivery frame, science is a body of ideas that somebody created, and every question has an answer at the back of the book. And instead, when we are into vignette 2 classroom, the sense-making frame, students have observed something and now they're trying to figure out, they're trying to make sense of this something, but they are developing knowledge, but they are using their knowledge for a purpose. So one aspect that I would like to really make clear is that when we are thinking about California NGSS instruction, we do need to have both frames. The sense-making frames, where the students are at the center of our instruction, but we do still have an important role of providing some information to students directly. Because what I said it is that you need to know something in order to make sense of something else. That's something that you need to know might be as simple as the vocabulary that you need to use to name the phases of the moon. But then there is a time and place for the students to be informed of this vocabulary. And you can know a lot of things, but never understand how to use that knowledge. The next slide is an example of this idea. And in the slides, you can see these all the parts of this engine. And our engineering students are fantastic at memorizing all the words of this engine, but they don't really grasp, for instance, how come that the little wheels that you see in the circle, the wheel of the starter motor, has to be smaller than the two-third wheel that is much bigger. So they might even know the name of those two parts, but they don't know why the structure of those parts enable the function that they have. And similarly, when we are thinking about a very popular life science topic like the structure of a cell, scientists have discovered all these parts, and we feel very proud when our students are able to memorize all these parts or even just part of these parts of the cells. But often then the students don't understand how these parts work together, or how, in what way did scientists figure out about these parts. So the science with the California NGSS is really about creating knowledge and using that knowledge because I'm engaged in practices and cross-cutting concept to make sense of something that I'm observing. So this is what we call the phenomena that we are observing. And the student is at the center of our classrooms, and is the one doing the sense making. The teacher, though, is not just hoping their best for the students to figure things out. The teacher is very carefully planning and facilitating the sense-making process, so that when we are changing instruction, we really need to think about the possibility for students to explore, examine, and really make sense of this idea. And the knowledge is something that they are going to use. So in the second vignette, I'm going now to focus more on the students in the second vignette. These students were engaged in this performance expectation. This is a middle school performance expectation from the NGSS. And depending on which middle school model you are using, it could be either in 6th grade or in 8th grade. The students that we have worked with were 8th grade students. And the focus of these lessons is developing using a model of the Earth, Sun, Moon system to describe the cyclic pattern of the lunar phases. The same standard is also asking students to explain the eclipses of the sun and the moon and the season. But in this unit, the students are limiting themselves to the lunar phases. So I wanted to show you with the next slides, some of the students have done these models that initial model that we have asked them to create. And then we sample which ideas are available in the classroom. And we have categorized this idea with these 3 whiteboards. So the writing in this whiteboard is made by the teacher, but the teacher is capturing the different ideas that the students have about phases of the moon. So I would like you to look at these images, and I would like you to think about how the students, do the students in each of these groups have the same ideas or the different ideas about how the moon phases work? And I also would like you to think, if you are the teacher of the students in this classroom, how are you going to use some of these ideas so that perhaps we want to combine the most productive ideas that we see from the classroom to create together a classroom version of the moon phases. So can you share some of your ideas in the chat window? Well, so one question from Mark is this a discipline-specific model? So as I was saying, depending on what your middle school chose, this could be the discipline-specific model. So in this case, the standard is in 6th grade. The classroom that I'm showing you right here is an 8th grade classroom, though. So it's the integrated model. So for example, one of the things that you might notice is that in every one of the diagram, there are 8 moons, and all those moons are different. Mm-hmm. Right. So another big idea that comes out from this observation is that the students number 2, for instance, does not make visible in this diagram the role of the sun in this relationship. So in 1 and 3, I see a starting of seeing the mechanics, so really an explanation of the phenomenon, while the students number 2 is still stuck on the observation nature of the moon, which is again is a very first point for students to be productive. At least I noticed that throughout 1 month, the moon is different. And now I'm trying to understand the why. But I first need to observe the appearance. Yeah, in model 1, what we also have the students adding is the movement of the moon around the Earth, and also the rotation of the Earth around its axis, which is not present in the other one. Yeah, and Krista mentioned I would love to combine 1 and 3. And that would be exactly the role of the teacher when you are asking your students, give me your very first idea of the phases of the moon, and how does the moon, sun, and Earth work together to see the phases of the moon. Your role would be to capture the best ideas from all the students to work together and make a classroom version, so every one of your students might feel productive. Even student number 2, we can still mention that the student number 2 has some productive ideas because he's observing that the different phases are different. Every phase is different. Right, and another observation that you can see from the 1 and 2 is that 1 and 3 is that number 3 is showing how the moon would look like from the outside, being outside the Earth, while number 1 is depicting the image of the moon seen from the Earth. Yeah. So, and even to add further to these analyses, because one really good aspect of the California NGSS is that if I'm telling the students, these are the phases of the moon, like for instance, as I would do by showing students information from the textbook, I can show them these images. But then unless I'm asking them to really make sense of these images, I don't really know what's going on into their head. And so again, both frames are necessary, something that I'm going to make sense with the initial model. And then I can even provide some students existing models, but the students need to work out how these models are possible. Like for instance, in this case, let me see, is in both pages? Yes, in this case, if I'm adding information to the students from these textbooks, actually these are online pages, I can, the students might notice that in both 1 and 3, the sunlight was missing. So what would cause to my thinking if I'm actually adding a sunlight? And the other things that I might ask, is the sunlight really so parallel with respect to the Earth? So we want the students to both create their own knowledge, making visible what they have in their head using the practices, but also we do want the students to become critical consumer of information that they might find in textbooks, like or websites. So because it's really a challenging point of view, and is a critical shift in understanding, because the scale frame of sun, moon, and the Earth is such that it becomes very complex to understand how can I see certain things from the Earth, and how these same things might look different if I look from a different point of view. And an interesting things that the teacher in this classroom did after the students solved their understanding of the phases of the moon seen from the Earth, using this model of sun, earth, and moon, and the light bouncing off, their assessment was about, could you now describe the phases of Venus? So now they had to use the same modeling strategy, the same modeling practice, but now the body systems was a different system, in which now Venus is an object that is rotating around the sun rather than rotating around the earth. So, and that was a very satisfactory process by the students, because they were really very much engaging, keep shifting reference frame from the earth to the outside of the earth and so forth. So what I wanted to mention that in this California NGSS classroom, the students are making their ideas visible. They are discussing their ideas with the peers and the teachers. And there is a lot of writing and reading that is discipline specific. And all this thinking in the classroom needs to be made visible so the students can keep working on refining their ideas. So I would like, before we are taking the break, the question and answer break, I would like you to think about, so how is lesson planning going to change if we are moving instruction into towards the sense-making frame? And what might be some of the challenges the students experience from moving from the information frame, the more traditional information frame, to the sense-making frame? And then what tools and resources do you need at your school to make your classroom more student-centered? So let's take 5 minutes for you to, well, at least 5 minutes, but let's see, we can take more, for you to write your questions in the chat window, and I'll try to answer the best I can.
Hi, I have a question.
Yes.
Thank you for allowing me to join, first of all. And my question is, are there any recommendations in a class for a classroom filled with students of different learning styles? Like I, at a private school, cannot make large modifications to my curriculum. However, I do have a few students in my class that I have to accommodate. They're either slower learning styles, or like a fully confirmed ADHD type of student.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So I think, oh, by the way, yes, this webinar is being recorded. So if you want to review it later, it's also available. But in response to your question, what we are seeing is that if we are engaging the students, and you know your student better than anybody else, but when we are engaging the student in small group work, we see that the students that seems most unfocused become focused, because we are breaking up the large class ideas, and we are allowing students to pace their own in small groups. So that might become a strategy for you to allow your slower kids more time to work, or perhaps, you know, provide them more scaffold. But the small group organization might allow you to better manage different learning styles. But the one thing that I think is important is to really make an effort across, for instance, not every day, but at least entire week, is that we are highlighting the ideas of every student, so that they feel that their thinking and their effort to engage in this hard work is valued by the teacher. We call it the positioning that the teacher has of the idea of students. And we have seen that the students are very much reacting very positively and with more focus in their work with science. When the teacher is really harvesting ideas, rebroadcasting those ideas for the students, and in particular for the students that might be a bit more reluctant in sharing, that could be your role. Again, harvesting the idea from the small groups and broadcasting it to everybody. Let me see what I have here. Okay, it is possible to have an administrator observe a class and see chaos, where as the teacher and facilitator, I see student learning take place. That's exactly one of the reasons why in the California Science Framework, we wrote an entire chapters for administrators that often are not used to observe control chaos in the classroom. So what we have been advising administrators and teachers to tell their administrators, don't measure the noise that is in my classroom. Rather, ask the students, what are they doing? And they should be able to very precisely respond that they are trying to figure out something. So that noise is a response to talk that is a strategic talk around the figuring out, critically thinking about phenomena. So it should be a welcome effort. And we do see that there is also some reluctancy from the administrators to see this change in the classroom, but already sitting efforts and more classroom noise seems to be becoming more acceptable. Right, and of course, Janet, you are mentioning that in my lesson plan, we should not just give the students the information, but allow some frustration time to figure them out. But the one thing that I keep saying to teachers is that teachers need to know every information that the students will have to figure out so that we can really help them along the way. Mark mentioned that some students may experience uncertainties. Yeah, they are not familiar with the critical thinking part. But classroom dynamic must be controlled, yes. And so we should not allow the most outspoken students to dominate the discussion. Right, and mindset so that students understand that the incorrect answer during a discovery is okay. And those incorrect answers are the best tool that teachers have to understand what the students are thinking. To me, those are really the hook that I need as an instructor to figure out what am I going to do next to change their mind. But if I never allow them and I'm not creating an environment where everybody is required to share ideas, then there will be some students that will keep going with their misinformed scientific ideas, and there will be those students that keep thinking science is not for me, I'm not going to do science ever. So it's a really nice new dynamic that NGSS is providing us. One question is, my biggest challenge is knowing which new science curricula truly meet the NGSS standards, especially for grade K6. Has anyone reviewed curriculum to help schools make informed curriculum choices? In response to this question, the State Board of Education last November released a list of instructional material curriculum that was acceptable for California NGSS. Some didn't make that cut, but that cut is rather low. And I can share, let me make a note because I can share K8 instructional material list, okay? I'll do it in the next pause. And But then I know that county offices of education and even the California Science Project, statewide, we have adopted a process for evaluating instructional materials. I don't know if private schools are going through the same process or not, but public school need to go through the process of adoption using this toolkit. And it's a multi-layer toolkit because we are moving analysis from the superficial, are even my standards there, to do I have materials for the teacher to support this type of classroom discourse engagement. So there is a tool out there, and online there are also new reports that are coming out from, I believe it's called Education Report. They are analyzing, no, sorry, they have been analyzing middle school curriculum nationwide with respect to the NGSS. They are now working on the elementary one, and it should be available in the summer. Unfortunately, David, for grade 9, 12, we don't have a list yet, but again, the tool to analyze instructional materials can be and should be applied also to the high school. So Mark is asking about the integrated NGSS aligned with the AP classes. They do not align in the sense, so there are, the points of alignment are very different because, as you are mentioning, AP classes are discipline specific, while the integrated, the 3-course model from the NGSS is discipline specific, but they are including topics from earth science. So the scope of the two curriculum are different, and the goal for the learning of the students is different from AP than in an integrated NGSS class. I can also imagine that not all your students are taking AP classes maybe, so that is also another consideration, that we are really thinking that NGSS curriculum is affordable for every student, and then AP classes could be delivered, could be used by a subset of students. Yes, I'm going to find the list online at the next site, at the next time, or I'm going to give it to Paul, and Paul is going to deliver it to everybody that registered to this webinar. And Maureen, stay tuned for the next slides because we can help you there. So moving on, before moving to additional resources for your instruction, I wanted to give you some more perspective of how do we know that this works for my students. And I'm using a slide that I presented also at the last webinar, where I'm showing here that since the 90s, so all the way to the left of the slides, there started to be a very strong convergence in research regarding on how students should learn the best science, and in which environment students are of any learning styles are best learning science. And those were really the documents that spearheaded in July 2011 the release of a framework for K-12 science education. So that compendium provided the scaffold to the development of the next generation science standards, but was really summarizing 20 plus years of research. And what I added here at the bottom in the orange box is that since 2011, there continue to be releases, especially from the national academies. So all of these reports that you see right here on these slides are freely available by the National Research Council. You can download the PDF file for free. But what they are highlighting is a confirmation of everything that has been said about students learning for the past 20 plus years. In particular, what we are going to analyze in a second is the How People Learn 2 that has been released and let me type in. So you can type in the Google search, English learner in STEM subject, you will find it. And they have been all published by the national academies. We have used all of these documents up to 2013 to develop our own California Science Framework. Also that, and is in the next slide, also that document is available for download for free. Sorry, here it is. And I wanted to, for the next few slides, to focus on very key specific elements of Chapter 11 of the California framework that relates to how students learn science. So in this document, in the California Science Framework, we have highlighted how students are more likely to understand, use ideas, and retain those ideas if they have experiences related to that. So just having information delivered to them might allow the student to retain the information for a while, but is not experiential enough for them to really understand them and make sense of them. In addition, students come with existing ideas. Learning is an active process, and we need to foster the ability of students to actively apply what they have learned. And this is what we are writing in the California framework is was borrowed by How People Learn, first published in 2011, and now we have a second publication, 2018, that is confirming everything that was shared in. So after 17 years of research, we are confirming the fact that in order for students to learn best, we need to provide them with strategies to retrieve their prior knowledge, help them develop their conceptual framework, and allow them with metacognition. So if you go on page 4 of your handout, you are going to see the summary of these 3 key ideas that come from How People Learn, Book 1. The specific addition of How People Learn, number 2, involves the fact that learning is very much determined by the context. So the classroom rules that are fostering equity, that are feeling students safe, is part of the component of students learning. And also there is a cultural component to learning. Different culture have different learning dynamics. And if I better learn the way of learning of the students in my classroom, I'm better able to engage them. So I'm going to take a second for you to review page 4, because we are going to use it in the next exercise. And I'm going to find the link to the instructional materials for you. So as you're using page 4, I would like you to do the following exercise. I would like you to go to vignette 2 again. So the vignette 2 is on page 3 of your handout, the bottom portion only. And I would like you to see what have been the opportunities for the teacher to elicit students' ideas, build conceptual framework, and make students think about what they know. Let's take 5 minutes, and I'm going to find the link for you. And we have 1 more minute, so if you are ready to share on the chat window, we have Mark sharing that that the cycle of the moon is a pattern that repeats, and cyclical thinking happens also in other system. Right. Yeah, that is an interesting point that Mark is making in the chat window, that that different culture are using the lunar cycles to represent the beginning and the ending of a year. There is also a connection between the moon and the tides, which is also a great component for 8th grade, because now we are not only. All right, so one thing that it should be clear when we are looking at the California NGSS is that we cannot just step into our classroom and do NGSS like nothing, like it's easy. So on page 6, I'm sorry, it looks to me that is page 5 in your handout, but I wrote here page 6. There should be this diagram, this colored 4-wheel diagram, and it represents the 4 different phases that we are recommending teachers to organize their instruction around. So first of all, I need to think about, number 1, plan with big science ideas that connect to observable phenomena. So in the vignette, what is clear is that students had the time to look at the moon, take data about the moon across multiple months, together with other science that was going on in the classroom. But when the time came to figure out, to notice that is changing, and to notice that that there is a cycle there, then is the prime time for the teachers to start this unit. So, but this needs to be planned in advance. And then 2, 3, and 4 represent different phases of how we are going to engage students at the beginning of a unit, eliciting their initial ideas and their thinking, so that I can, as an instructor, I know where they are right now about their ideas, about their culture, perhaps, and so I can use it throughout instruction. And then in the next steps, and it's nothing of what I'm telling you is easy to do, but is something that puts more the students in the driver's seat, with us being very much the the coaches of their thinking. So supporting ongoing changes in students' ideas, and I keep asking for them to explain and make visible their ideas, and pressing for evidence-based explanation would be the culminating part of this cycle. So one thing that I wanted again to connect here, and is related to something that David was mentioning, that there are classrooms right now that are attempting to teach NGSS, but they don't have instructional material. They don't have curriculum to follow. So they are using old curriculum, but the one thing that they are doing is to really add a lot of classroom discourse in addition to the practices of the science and engineering practices of the NGSS. That's one first way where if you don't have instructional materials, you should reviewing what you're doing right now and figuring out at what point throughout my current lesson plans I can have students ask more questions, develop and use models, and planning out investigation, etc. Because one thing that I can imagine is that instructional materials might not be sufficient to really create an engaging space for my students to do what I want. And it's not just what the textbook tells me that I should be doing, but really about following and pushing the students to do more of these practices in the classroom. So I would like to invite you to look at this list. So this list is again on page 1 of your handouts. And I would like you to compare this page, this list, again with vignette number 2 and figure out which one are the practices that this teacher, and we are back in 2013 here, the NGSS had just been adopted, so she didn't have curriculum, but she managed to include practices into the instruction. So as you are reading the second vignette, can you figure out which practices, and I'm going to put back the slide in a second. I wanted to put back this one. So this is the task. Read vignette number 2 again. So this will be your third time. Can you see the practices? Right. So I see that definitely there is a focus on the first practice, asking question. And very appropriately, the teacher is helping students in designing a question that is scientifically investigable. So again, teachers have a very fundamental role, even though this classroom are student-centered. The teacher models for the students how to talk, how to write, how to read in science, how to do any one of these science and engineering practices. Right, and we see a lot of analyzing and interpreting data, developing and using model, plenty of engaging in argument from evidence. And one of the reasons why the teacher is doing different activities using different styles is because the students, as they are engaging in this argument, they need to experiment with their own ideas, and they need to validate ideas using other activities and so forth. So using different modality of learning helps them solidify their learning. That exactly, we're using styrofoam ball, but then I'm asking you to draw it. I'm going to have you use a simulation. So all these modalities are stretching my abilities to make the teacher visible what is that I have on my head, and allows me to see it. And allows me to really play around, because just being reaching the eureka moment once might not be enough. I really need to experiment multiple times with my knowledge to really be sure that I understand how the phases of the moon happen. And at the end of this unit, for this particular teacher, she was so sure that her students were master in developing models of phases of the moon, that she was very sure that they would be also doing a good job in modeling the phases of Venus as seen from the Earth. And that was an incredible success. And also number 8 is one of the, I would say, most used practice, obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. And that is one of the practice that I believe lives in any discipline, not only in science. So I wanted to bring back to you one of the, here it is, one of the pictures that we use in workshop number 1. So this comes from chapter 1 of the California framework. And it allows you to see how student using inquiry, so that is the name that we are using for the hands-on sense making, are observing the real world, phenomena in the real world, like the phases of the moon, and they are ending up by developing explanation of the phases of the moon. And in all the way throughout, they are asking questions, they are carrying out and planning investigation, they have to measure, they collect data, making sense of data, they're developing their models, and so forth. So we call that the knowledge building and sense making part. But at the center of all of this is this social interaction highlighted by the practice of arguing from evidence. So what we should be realizing that arguing, critiquing, and analyzing is not seen as with a negative connotation in a science classroom, is actually a positive practice that scientists use to really make sense of each other's ideas. I keep sharing, so my background is in high energy physics. I'm a physicist, and there's nothing worse for a scientist or for a particle physicist to give a presentation to colleagues and not a single person is saying anything. What we want from our colleagues, if we really have an impact on our community, is to be inundated by questions, by argument, by critique, by analysis of what we are saying, because that means that our ideas are valued by our community. I know that is a very different world than a classroom, and what we are emphasizing that for science classroom, we do want to have this respectful evaluation of ideas, but it should be a critical thinking process that our students can practice in our science classroom, so then they can keep it with them throughout all their life. Whatever decision they make, they will know how to gather data, analyze data, and critiquing this data that might be presented to them, and create better prospect for themselves. So we are also looking at the long term. Yeah, and at this point, you know, it should be familiar to many that practices is not something that we have only in science. We have practices in almost every discipline. So the slide that I'm showing you right now, and definitely, Krista, art classes, they are not mentioned here, but I did work with my counterpart at the California Arts Project, and they do have studio practices that match very well with the science practices. Not every practices are the same. Every discipline has their own practices of the community. But what you see in this slide is, at least for math, science, and English language art, we are asking students not only to know things, but we are asking them also to demonstrate ability to do things, including history. History is full of inquiry when we are reading the New California History and Social Studies framework. However, when we are looking at this slide, it looks like they are all separated from each other. So when you're looking at page 2 of your handout, you are going to see this slide. You're going to see the image that is in this slide. This is a document that has been developed by Stanford. And we are using this document, this diagram, in chapter 11 of the California framework, just so the teacher could start a conversation on how these practices might be similar to each other. When I look at this diagram, I'm happy that there are very productive convergences. Like, for instance, when I look at math and science together, so the purple triangle-ish kind of things, modeling is used both in math and in science. But then when I look at this diagram, I also see that there are a substantial missed opportunity to integrate even further. Like, for instance, when I look, that is the one that drives me nuts, is in the math practice number 6, attend to precision is only for mathematics. So we are teaching science. You should not bother your students to measure precisely or to even precisely write down the digits after the comma in a sensible ways or using the right vocabulary, because they just do that in math, not in science. So in reality, so besides these jokes, what we are inviting teachers, especially those teachers that are teaching multiple subject area, is to look at these practices, including art, including history, and really allow themselves to discover the connection between these practices so that they can make this connection more transparent to our students. So imagine students that are moving from math to science, and they discover that I know a lot of things that I could do in science because I just came from a math classroom, or from English into science, or from history into science. So we really want to bring all these prior knowledge that the students have learned in other area into our science classroom, and everything that the students are learning in our science classroom to be brought into all the other disciplines. Because after all, we are teaching students in addition to teaching a subject area. So, and the other piece that I wanted to relate to you, that is one of the other components that you will find in Chapter 11 of the California Science Framework, is the use of this 5E learning sequence. I decided to add this slide because of a question that was asked to me at the prior webinar. The 5E is one of the models that we are recommending to structure your lesson. And the reason why we are doing that is because we are allowing students to engage, explain, explore, evaluate, and assessment should be carried out all the way throughout. So the 5E allows us to very systematically provide students with the opportunity that how people learn is telling us improves their learning. And I was highlighting here the ways that it might be done. Again, I know that since we wrote this in the framework, when teachers are reviewing, and this is something that is on page 6 of your handout, this is in a graphical form. Teachers are even making a better transformation of the 5E using the practices and using the how people learn, so that the 5E really becomes a scaffold for really design this very engaging instructional unit. So yeah, we have time. I would like to make one more Q&A for you to take advantage of before we are heading for the home run. So let me set it for 5 more minutes. Type into the chat window. Or you can also unmute yourself. I like this idea of field trips where possibly students are asked to not just think the science aspect of what they're learning, but the math, the English. Imagine the technology that you can reflect on if you go to the Chabot Space and Science Center. Yeah, that would definitely be an example of cross-curricular. Yes, and the Exploratorium is one of my favorite spaces where not only I can use my science, but my math, my art, my history. It's really a good space. So middle school curriculum, again, earlier I shared the link. Let me do it again. The link to the adopted, can I do this? I think so. To the adopted program. So this is the list that comes from the California State Board of Education. However, you don't have to use this list. You can also, something that you could probably work with is the, especially in middle school, is the Stanford Integrated Middle School curriculum. And when you go to their website, they have two versions. One is the integrated version from the California framework, but they also work with San Francisco Unified, and they have modules that if you are not following the integrated model, but you're at the disciplinary specific model, you can use that. One reason why I like the Stanford Integrated Middle School curriculum is that, number one, it's free, and the modules are downloadable online. Number two, it's really thoughtful in integrating language development together with the science. Science, starting from upper elementary and all the way through high school, becomes so dense in terms of academic vocabulary that if we don't really plan it appropriately, then the students will really be missing the opportunity to learn a rich scientific vocabulary. And then the other things why I like the integrated middle school curriculum, so it's free, include language developments. The units are doable. They have been tested in California schools. And three, sorry, no, we are at four now. It comes also with assessments. And they're high quality assessment. There are smaller assessment types and larger assessment types. So it's already another part of the work that often is very low quality in the instructional materials available for purchase. So my recommendation, if you're teaching middle school, start by looking at the Stanford Integrated Middle School curriculum. If you're not teaching middle school, you could still look a bit at how they do that, but really implement your practices into and the cross-cutting concept into your instruction, and start with that. So Mark is mentioning that the discipline-specific model for middle school was an accommodation to concern with the integrated model. Regardless if this is correct, do you think these will continue to be supported as an alternative? Yes, you are correct in both of your statement and the question. So in chapter, I forgot which chapter, but in the middle school chapter of the California Science Framework, we are explaining the accommodation that was made from the integrated model and the discipline-specific model. Both models are going to be supported by the California State Board of Education. Both models can be found in instructional materials as viable models. And so, yeah, either model will work. So it's really up to you and your circumstances. So don't we need to get the Venn diagram you shared to be even? If that's correct, Margaret, you are totally correct. That's what I actually, when I work in person with teachers, I have them use just the strip of paper with the practices without even telling them if it's math, science, or English language art. And I'm asking them, which one would you like your students to do in your science classroom? And basically they are taking them all. And then I show them the Venn diagram from Stanford, and they are thinking, you know, yeah, there are these productive convergences, but oh boy, Stanford, they could really have done a much better job. So I always like when educators like you are reflecting on materials that are presented to them, but then you are using your own classroom experience. You have decades probably of instruction in your classroom, and you can definitely analyze and critique and argue and evaluate. It's one of our scientific practices after all. on what we are presenting you to make it more applicable to your classroom. Mark is mentioning that as a private school, we don't have the funding support for the CAS that public schools. We use the MAP testing. Are you familiar with these tests and how well these align with NGSS? No, Mark, I didn't know. Because I would say that this was our first year for the California Science Project to a bit more systematically work with private school teachers. And so we are, you know, besides enjoying very much working with private school teachers, like every teacher we work with, but we are just starting to learn some of the differences that there are in the support structure for private versus public school. And you know, maybe Paul might even help you further, but I made a note to myself to learn more about this testing. I'm not familiar with this testing. However, the CAST test is publicly available, not the one that is administered to students, but there are a lot of samples that are available for use. I'm making a note because we can, I can bring you the link. So let me continue. Oh my goodness, it's 5 o'clock right now. So I just wanted to finish up, like give me 2 minutes by allowing you to look, and we look at this table on webinar 1, I believe, but this is a very important table because so far I hope I gave you enough resources to start thinking about how can we shift instruction. And that this table highlights some of the ideas on how I could change my instruction. And keep in mind that at the top of this table, we are asking more of this and less of this. We are not saying none of this and all of this. So there needs to be a balance, but you have to really understand that we are trying to allow students to become better critical consumer of information, creator of their own information, evaluator of information, and the teacher need to really figure out what they know. So the role of formative assessment is dramatically important in our science classroom. So in table 1.2, you see a series of a lot of ideas on what things should be changed. And, you know, I would recommend you to analyze which one resonate with you. One thing that we see teachers challenged is that you should not think that you need to make all of these changes at once in your classroom. It does take time. And so if you even engage with 1 or 2, you are going to go a long way, and the way the students are going to respond to you is going to be more productive. And then from the chapter 12 of the California framework, if there are administrators listening right now from the participants that are on this webinar, but also if you are a chair of your science department, what I think we really need is to really support the teachers that are trying to be innovator in their own classroom, and so to really elevate and encourage the spirit that they have in trying to change the classroom to make the students more responsive and more engaged in the science. So it takes time. The change takes time. We see the teacher can definitely make fantastic changes already within 1 year of constant shifting the practice in the classroom, but really they will become very fluent in the NGSS moves and very confident of what they are doing in managing their students, perhaps about after 3 years. We need the time and the space for teachers to share what worked, what didn't work, and to reflect on what to do things better. Again, all the suggestions that we are providing in Chapter 11 of the California Framework, you have to take them and reflect on how might I adapt this for my own classroom. And I think the other aspect that often science teachers feel very isolated, and so that the principal, especially for secondary science classroom, principals don't even want to approach science classroom because they are too intimidating. But we really need to create school spaces where educators, parents, and perhaps also the community really engage in this new way of instructing our students, because what we see is that when we are allowing students to develop these practices, for instance, this capacity of becoming scientists, it comes as a surprise to parents. Like, for instance, during engineering nights or STEM nights, where parents come to school and they really see the students, their own kids, very familiar with explaining things to others. And parents are really shocked to see that my student, a scientist, I would have never thought that. So we are really changing the thinking mindset, not only of students, but also of parents, that then on their end, they might become more supportive of alternative pathway for our students. So this, I believe, was my last slide. One thing that I wanted to, Paul is mentioning about the survey, which is a very short survey. Another things, and I can be here on the web. If you have to leave, please, by all means, take the survey and then you can leave. But I can be here and answer your question. I would like also to let you know that Paul has organized 2 summer institutes with people from the California Science Project, and he's going to send you another reminder that you can register for this 4-day free professional learning. And we are going to have, it's for K-12 teachers, but we are going to divide it into K-5, 6-8, and high school, depending on how many people are attending. We are going to have one session this summer at Cal State East Bay and another session at Cal State Northridge. And Paul can give you all additional information. He will send you a flyer, and the link to the registration is here, and he will be sending it to you. So please don't hesitate to ask me any additional question. I'm here. Oh, and the one resource that I would definitely ask you, if you have time this summer and you don't have time for the institutes, is to purchase and review this book, Ambitious Science Teaching. This is the resource that we are recommending on Chapter 11 of the California Science Framework. You don't even have to buy the book. You can go to their own website and basically you can find every chapter of this book as resources and tools, and plenty of videos. Yes, I now saved the chat. I think I did, meaning that I will be sending it to Paul, and Paul can send you the transcript of the chat window. And yeah, maybe let's wait 2 more minutes if you have any other questions.